Early December 1943. Cairo, Egypt. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt paused with his pen hovering over the page, aware that the words he was about to inscribe would influence the trajectory of World War II. His close advisor, Harry Hopkins, had just returned from an intense discussion with General George C. Marshall, the officer widely expected to orchestrate the most ambitious military operation in history. Yet Roosevelt could not shake a persistent unease. Nights had become restless. The thought of leaving such a powerful commander away from Washington weighed heavily on him. A momentous decision loomed. America would place its most assertive battlefield general on the sidelines, while a skilled strategist with no first-hand combat command experience would be entrusted with leading the European invasion. At the time, few realized that this choice would redefine what it meant to exercise military authority. Success would hinge less on individual tactical brilliance and more on the ability to organize, coordinate, and direct forces on a scale previously unseen, a kind of leadership that would ultimately prove more decisive than the valor of any single general. The context for this decision had been forming since May 1943, when the North African campaign concluded with a staggering surrender of roughly 267,000 Axis troops in Tunisia. Among the American commanders who had earned distinction in that campaign was Lieutenant General George Smith Patton, Jr., a figure whose reputation alone instilled fear among enemy forces. At 57, Patton embodied the archetype of the quintessential American military officer, meticulous in appearance, flamboyant yet functional in his personal style, and relentless in combat. His desert uniforms were custom-made, brass buttons gleaming under the North African sun. Twin revolvers with ivory grips hung at his hips, not as mere showpieces but as weapons he wielded with deadly efficiency. Known for a colorful and often profane vocabulary, Patton's demeanor could intimidate his subordinates, while his operational audacity had repeatedly demonstrated an uncanny ability to dismantle opposing armies faster than conventional military doctrine would predict. Patton's rise to prominence was rooted in a long military lineage and personal tenacity. Born on November 11, 1885 in San Gabriel, California, he was raised in a family steeped in military tradition, with ancestors who had fought in both the American Revolution and the Civil War. His grandfather, a Confederate colonel, fell at the Third Battle of Winchester. These familial narratives instilled in Patton a sense of martial identity from an early age. He faced academic hurdles, struggling with what would later be recognized as dyslexia, but he compensated through sheer willpower and an unyielding drive to excel. He briefly attended the Virginia Military Institute before transferring to West Point in 1904. Despite a challenging start, including a required repeat of his first year, Patton graduated from West Point on June 11, 1909, ranking 46th in a class of 103 cadets. Even as a young officer, his competitive nature and assertive personality set him apart. Shortly after graduation, his path diverged from conventional military routines when he represented the United States at the 1912 Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon. Patton placed 5th overall. Patton's encounters with international athletic competition early in his life strengthened his commitment to personal achievement and reinforced his belief that the United States required military leaders capable of confronting any global adversary. His exceptional physical abilities, combined with the social advantages gained through his marriage to Beatrice Ayer, the daughter of a prominent Massachusetts industrialist, provided him with both influence and resources that accelerated his military progression. His first real exposure to combat occurred in 1916 during the U.S. expedition against Pancho Villa in Mexico. Serving as an aide to Brigadier General John J. Pershing, Patton, then a young lieutenant, led a motorized strike against Villa's forces. The raid resulted in the deaths of 3 of Villa's men, including one of his officers. Patton personally used his ivory-handled revolvers to kill 2 of the enemies and then, in a strikingly bold gesture, affixed their bodies to the hoods of his vehicles while returning to headquarters. The episode was both shocking and attention-grabbing, earning him national notoriety as reportedly the first American officer to employ motorized vehicles in a combat setting. Even more consequential was the solid bond it created between Patton and Pershing, who would serve as a mentor and advocate throughout much of Patton's career. When the United States entered World War I in 1917, Patton accompanied Pershing to the Western Front in France. It was there that he discovered his true military focus: armored warfare. Tanks, still in their infancy, were unreliable and experimental, yet Patton quickly recognized their transformative potential. He took charge of establishing the U.S. Tank School at Langres, France, personally crafting the instructional guidelines and operational strategies for the new force. Drawing on French tank techniques and consultations with British commanders, he developed a distinctly American approach that emphasized speed, maneuverability, and bold offensive action. In September 1918, Patton led the newly formed American Tank Corps in the Meuse-Argonne offensive. During the engagement, he sustained wounds from machine gun fire while advancing on foot alongside his tanks, a display of courage that earned him the Distinguished Service Cross and cemented his reputation as a fearless leader who led from the front. Following the war, Patton became one of the most vocal proponents of mechanized warfare in the USS Army. Throughout the 1920 seconds and 1930 seconds, he published articles, conducted practical experiments, and tirelessly argued that future conflicts would be determined by fast, heavily armored forces. During this period, he collaborated with Major Dwight Eisenhower, whom he had first met in 1919 while working on tank development and doctrine. Despite differing temperaments, the two shared a vision of mechanized operations that military leadership largely dismissed as costly and unconventional. Budget limitations and traditionalist views relegated tanks primarily to infantry support roles, yet Patton persistently sought innovation. He designed the MUN 8913 cavalry saber, later known as the Patton saber, and authored numerous works on cavalry and maneuver tactics, consistently emphasizing the importance of maintaining mobility and offensive capability in modern warfare. By 1940, as Europe descended into widespread conflict, Patton's moment of influence arrived. Elevated to the rank of brigadier general in October of that year, he assumed command of an armored brigade and immediately began preparing his troops with the aggressive, fast-moving tactics he had refined over 2 decades of study and experimentation. George S. Patton played a pivotal role in preparing American forces for combat in North African conditions by establishing a specialized training facility in California's Mojave Desert. The center, sprawling and rigorously organized, aimed to replicate the harsh environment soldiers would face abroad. Patton's approach to training was notoriously severe. He demanded near perfection and set standards that many deemed unattainable. Yet, those who endured his methods emerged as some of the most disciplined and effective units in the U.S. Army. When Operation Torch commenced in November 1942, Patton was entrusted with commanding the Western Task Force. He oversaw the landing of 3,500 American troops on Moroccan beaches, marking the United States' first significant offensive against Axis powers in the European theater. Despite encountering resistance from Vichy French forces, adverse weather, and logistical hurdles, Patton's troops secured their objectives and advanced inland rapidly. Casablanca fell in just 3 days. Recognizing Patton's composure and tactical success, the Sultan of Morocco awarded him the Wissam Alawite with a citation in French that proclaimed, "The lions in their dens tremble at his approach." More importantly, the operation demonstrated that American forces were capable of executing complex amphibious assaults and overcoming determined opposition. Patton's accomplishments in Morocco led to his promotion to lieutenant general and greater responsibilities in the ongoing North African campaign. Following a devastating setback at Kasserine Pass in February 1943, where German forces under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel broke through American lines, inflicting over 6,000 casualties and capturing substantial equipment, Patton was called upon to restore order. Major General Lloyd Fredendall, the previous corps commander, had failed to maintain effective leadership. On March 6, 1943, Patton assumed command and immediately instituted sweeping reforms. He enforced strict uniform regulations requiring soldiers to wear helmets and full combat attire even far from the front lines. Daily schedules were tightly structured, with inspections and equipment checks becoming routine. Patton moved continuously among his units, interacting directly with troops, assessing readiness, and insisting on proactive patrolling and offensive operations, even while on the defensive. Within a matter of days, the impact was evident. Soldiers displayed improved discipline, alertness, and morale. Patton also brought Major General Omar Bradley on as deputy, valuing his steady judgment to complement Patton's aggressive style. Together, they transformed the Second Corps into a capable fighting force. When American forces next engaged the Germans at El Ghoutar in late March, they successfully held positions and launched counterattacks, proving that under competent leadership and rigorous training, U.S. training, troops could rival experienced German units. Patton's reputation grew further during the invasion of Sicily in July 1943. Commanding the 7th Army, he led 90,000 men onto southern Sicilian beaches on July 10, tasked nominally with protecting the left flank of British General Bernard Montgomery's 8th Army advancing northward. Rather than remain in a supporting role, Patton seized the initiative when Montgomery's troops became bogged down near Catania. He launched a rapid campaign westward, capturing Palermo on July 22 in an advance that astonished allies and adversaries alike. Subsequently, he turned east, racing along the northern coast toward Messina, effectively competing with Montgomery to seize the strategic port first. Patton reached Messina on August 17, ahead of the British forces. Although some critics argued that his focus on speed over tactical encirclement of German troops was militarily questionable, the maneuver reinforced his image as a bold, determined commander capable of achieving extraordinary results. The Sicilian campaign concluded in 38 days, with approximately 24,850 Allied casualties, significantly weakening Italy's war effort and opening the Mediterranean to Allied operations. However, Patton's aggressive style also sowed the seeds of controversy. On August 3, 1943, he visited the 15th Evacuation Hospital near Nicosia, encountering Private Charles H. Cool, a 26-year-old soldier from Indiana diagnosed with battle fatigue. Perceiving such conditions as a sign of cowardice, Patton demanded an explanation. Upon learning that the soldier was struggling with nervous exhaustion under shelling, Patton reacted violently, striking Cool with his gloves, calling him a coward and ordering him back to the front lines immediately. This incident would spark widespread debate, overshadowing some of Patton's military achievements and influencing the trajectory of his career in the months to follow. Medical staff were initially stunned by the events, but the matter was formally logged through official medical channels and temporarily contained. 1 week later, on August 10th, General George S. Patton visited the 93rd Evacuation Hospital. During this visit, he came across 21-year-old Private Paul G. Bennett, a soldier suffering from battle fatigue. Bennett had spent 4 years actively engaged in combat and had performed admirably until reaching his psychological limit. When Patton inquired about the source of Bennett's distress, the young soldier admitted that he felt unable to continue. Patton's anger erupted with far greater intensity than his previous outburst. He struck Bennett twice, the first blow strong enough to dislodge the soldier's helmet liner. Then, drawing one of his ivory-handled revolvers, Patton brandished it near Bennett's head, threatening to execute him on the spot for what he deemed cowardice. He repeatedly denounced Bennett as a coward and ordered the medical personnel either to send the soldier back to the front lines immediately or to press charges against him. Witnessing the assault, the doctors and nurses were horrified. Several of them documented the incident in formal reports. These accounts eventually reached Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, who commanded the Second Corps at the time. Out of personal loyalty to Patton, Bradley stored the reports securely in his safe. However, independent reports had already traveled through medical channels to the Surgeon General's office, and on August 16th they were brought to the attention of General Dwight D. Eisenhower. Eisenhower faced a profoundly difficult decision. Patton was arguably one of the most formidable Allied commanders, celebrated for his tactical brilliance and relentless drive qualities deemed crucial for upcoming operations. Yet he had physically assaulted subordinates, threatened to kill a soldier, and demonstrated behavior that violated both military law and basic ethical standards. The incidents exposed a serious character flaw, an inability to regulate his temper, raising legitimate doubts about his suitability for high command. Eisenhower opted for a measured response. On August 17th, he sent Patton a sharply worded letter emphasizing that, although decisive leadership was sometimes necessary in wartime, it could never justify cruelty, abuse of vulnerable personnel, or displays of uncontrolled rage in front of troops. Eisenhower directed Patton to issue personal apologies to the soldiers involved, to the medical staff who had witnessed the episodes, and to every division under his command. Patton complied with the orders, though the process was deeply uncomfortable and humiliating for him. He traveled to each division, acknowledged his misconduct, and requested understanding. For some soldiers, this admission of wrongdoing reinforced their respect for him, while others began to question his judgment. Despite this internal reconciliation, the incidents remained classified within military channels until November 21, 1943, when radio commentator Drew Pearson made the slapping episodes public. The revelation provoked a nationwide uproar. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some defended Patton, arguing that effective military leadership demanded unwavering toughness and intolerance for weakness, while others condemned his behavior as brutal and incompatible with command responsibilities. Congressional leaders demanded explanations, tracing Secretary of War Henry Stimson and Army Chief of Staff George Marshall under intense scrutiny to justify Patton's continued service or to remove him entirely. The controversy unfolded amid critical strategic decisions that would shape not only Patton's career but also the futures of two other exceptional military leaders who had followed very different paths. Dwight D. Eisenhower, born on October 14, 1890, in Denison, Texas, came from a family of modest means. His father worked as a mechanic, and Eisenhower's childhood in Abilene, Kansas, was far less privileged than Patton's aristocratic upbringing. Eisenhower attended the United States Military Academy at West Point not out of early military ambition but because it provided a tuition-free higher education. Dwight D. Eisenhower completed his military education on June 12, 1915, graduating 61st out of 164 cadets. This cohort, later famously dubbed the class the stars fell on, went on to produce 59 generals, yet at the time of his graduation, Eisenhower showed few indications that he would become one of the most influential military leaders of the 20th century. The early years of his career were dominated by professional frustration. When the United States entered the First World War, Eisenhower was eager to command troops in combat, but instead he was assigned to Camp Colt in Pennsylvania, where he trained tank units. While he excelled in organizing the fledgling tank school preparing thousands of soldiers for future battle, he never deployed overseas. The armistice came before he could see action, leaving him with a sense of having missed the pivotal experience that had defined the generation of his peers. Following the war, Eisenhower reverted to his permanent rank of captain before eventually being promoted to major, but advancement was slow and incremental. In 1919, he joined the Army's Transcontinental Motor Convoy, a 2-month journey across the United States that exposed the dismal state of the nation's roadways. This undertaking, together with his experience in tank training, convinced him that mobility, mechanized forces, and solid infrastructure would be critical to future military conflicts. That same year, at Fort Meade, Maryland, Eisenhower met Major George S. Patton. Despite coming from very different backgrounds and having contrasting personalities, the two officers formed a close professional bond. They spent countless hours discussing armored warfare tactics, experimenting with equipment, and co-authoring articles promoting the potential of tanks in modern combat. However, their ideas were ahead of their time, and they faced criticism from superiors committed to more conventional military doctrine. Through the 1922nd and 1932nd, Eisenhower's career advanced primarily through staff positions, which highlighted his organizational skills but kept him away from direct command in the field. He attended the Command and General Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, graduating at the top of his class of 275 officers in 1926. This achievement brought him to the attention of senior military leaders who valued strategic planning and administrative expertise. He served as aide and speechwriter to General John J. Pershing, assisting the renowned officer with memoirs, and later worked under Brigadier General Fox Connor in Panama. Connor became a mentor to Eisenhower, influencing his understanding of coalition operations and military history. Connor predicted the inevitability of another global conflict and emphasized that the United States would likely fight as part of an alliance alongside powers such as Britain and France. In 1933, Eisenhower became an aide to General Douglas MacArthur, who had recently assumed the position of Army Chief of Staff. Their professional relationship was challenging. MacArthur's brilliance and self-confidence often clashed with Eisenhower's practical and unassuming demeanor, requiring him to mediate between the General, Congress, and the Roosevelt administration. When MacArthur was assigned to the Philippines in 1935 to organize the nation's defense forces, Eisenhower accompanied him. Over the next 6 years, he gained invaluable experience in diplomacy, learning to navigate the complex dynamics among American advisors, Filipino officials, and MacArthur himself. These years taught him that military success depended on political backing, coalition work required negotiation, and that tact often achieved more than confrontation. By the time Eisenhower returned to the United States in 1939, war had erupted in Europe. His expertise in staff work quickly became indispensable as the army expanded and mobilized for potential conflict. His organizational skills, strategic foresight, and capacity for rigorous work drew the attention of General George C. Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Eisenhower participated in large-scale maneuvers in Louisiana in 1941, which highlighted the growing importance of mechanized forces, further establishing his reputation. Following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Marshall assigned Eisenhower to the War Plans Division in Washington. Initially tasked with planning operations in the Pacific, Eisenhower worked relentlessly, often sleeping at his office, and developed clear, actionable strategies that impressed senior leadership. By February 1942, he was appointed head of the War Plans Division, overseeing strategic planning for all theaters of operation. He advocated a Europe-first strategy, reasoning that Nazi Germany posed the most immediate threat, and his ability to see the broader picture while managing intricate details made him a vital asset. In June 1942, Marshall appointed Eisenhower to command U.S. forces in the European theater, despite the fact that he had never led troops in combat. Marshall recognized Eisenhower's exceptional skill in coalition management, and his new responsibilities included establishing American forces in Britain, maintaining cooperation with allies, and planning for the eventual invasion of France. Eisenhower excelled in diplomacy, forging strong relationships with Winston Churchill and British military leaders, and integrating American and British staffs into a unified Allied command. His talent for compromise on secondary issues while standing firm on critical objectives proved crucial to maintaining alliance cohesion. When Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa, was launched in November 1942, Eisenhower was chosen as Supreme Allied Commander. The campaign required navigating political complexities, coordinating with French forces of uncertain loyalty, and balancing the priorities of American and British commanders. Eisenhower's leadership was decisive. He negotiated ceasefires with French officers, managed disputes with Admiral François, and ensured Allied forces remained focused on defeating German forces. The success of the operation solidified his reputation as a capable leader, demonstrating that he could command multinational forces effectively, even without first-hand combat experience. Central to Eisenhower's rise was the mentorship and guidance of General George C. Marshall, born December 31, 1880, in Uniontown, Pennsylvania, whose strategic vision and trust in Eisenhower's. George C. Marshall was born into a family with Confederate leanings. His father had been a businessman in Virginia before relocating to Pennsylvania. Marshall's early education culminated at the Virginia Military Institute, where he graduated in 1901 at the top of his class as the senior cadet leader. Commissioned as a second lieutenant in the infantry, he spent the next 15 years in a series of assignments that quietly honed his leadership and organizational skills, although few outside the military recognized his extraordinary potential. Marshall's first major opportunity arose during World War I, when he served on the staff of the 1st Infantry Division in France. There, he displayed remarkable aptitude in operational planning and logistics, particularly in managing the movement of large formations across complex battlefields. During the Battle of Cantigny in May 1918, the first significant American-led offensive, his careful preparation was instrumental in achieving success. Later, in the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he coordinated the deployment of over 600,000 soldiers and 2,700 artillery pieces, an operation notable for its unprecedented scale in military history. Recognizing Marshall's exceptional talents, General John J. Pershing kept him close as an operations officer, entrusting him with responsibilities far exceeding his formal rank. Following the war, Marshall spent 2 decades rotating through various military roles that further cemented his reputation within the Army, though he remained largely unknown to the public. He served as an aide to Pershing, taught at the infantry school at Fort Benning, where he helped shape the next generation of military leaders, and held numerous staff positions that highlighted his extraordinary organizational abilities. Marshall's colleagues admired his integrity, sound judgment, and remarkable ability to identify promising officers. He maintained a small black notebook listing talented young officers, a register that would later supply key commanders for World War II. Figures such as Omar Bradley, Matthew Ridgway, Joseph Stilwell, and Dwight Eisenhower first came to his attention long before their later fame. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt made a bold and unconventional decision, promoting Marshall to Army Chief of Staff ahead of more senior officers. Roosevelt recognized that the looming global conflict would demand not merely a military tactician, but a skilled organizer capable of managing vast expansion, navigating Congress, and coordinating effectively with international allies. Marshall assumed the role on September 1, 1939, the very day Germany invaded Poland. At that time, the United States Army numbered roughly 174,000 men, ranking it 17th worldwide, and it was smaller than the Belgian Army. It was poorly equipped, inadequately trained, and structured for a type of war that had become obsolete. Over the next 6 years, Marshall would transform the U.S. Army through an exceptional combination of strategic foresight, political skill, and relentless determination. He cultivated strong relationships with Congress, providing candid testimony on military requirements, which led to enormous appropriations for expansion, equipment, and training. He established numerous training facilities nationwide, oversaw the creation of new divisions, and supervised the induction and preparation of millions of troops. He promoted officers based on talent rather than seniority, ensuring that capable leaders occupied the most crucial positions. He also worked to foster cooperation with the Navy despite long-standing inter-service tensions. Internationally, Marshall's diplomacy and organizational skill were equally vital. He navigated complex relations with Allied leaders, particularly Winston Churchill, whose strategic priorities often clashed with those of the United States. Most crucially, Marshall became the leading advocate for a direct Allied invasion of German-occupied France. From 1942 onward, he persistently pushed for a cross-channel assault, arguing it represented the quickest path to defeating Hitler. Churchill favored a peripheral approach through North Africa, Sicily, Italy, and the Balkans, what he described as Europe's soft underbelly. Marshall countered that this strategy risked diverting resources and prolonging the conflict. He also confronted internal challenges, negotiating with the Navy over allocation of resources for the Pacific Theater and persuading British planners to support a second front despite their fears of repeating World War I's devastating losses. By 1943, he secured Roosevelt's commitment to the cross-channel operation, codenamed Overlord, scheduled for May 1944. Despite having conceived, advocated for, and obtained approval for the invasion, Marshall did not personally command it. Nevertheless, he remained America's most trusted military leader. Allies and leaders across the spectrum recognized his influence. Churchill referred to him as the architect of Allied victory, Stalin placed his confidence in him, and Roosevelt relied on him without reservation. Even the British, who initially preferred one of their own as supreme Allied commander, accepted Marshall's judgment and organizational leadership. Through a combination of vision, meticulous planning, and extraordinary managerial skill, George C. Marshall not only reshaped the USA Army but also played a decisive role in the Allied victory in World War II, ensuring that the forces under his guidance were ready to meet the unprecedented challenges of global conflict. By the early 1940s, General John J. Pershing, now well into his 80s, had reached out to President Franklin D. Roosevelt to advocate for George C. Marshall's elevation. Observers in Congress anticipated Marshall's promotion, and military analysts widely expected it as a natural progression of his career, yet Marshall himself did not lobby for the position. Whenever questioned about his personal ambitions, he consistently emphasized that the decision belonged to the president and must reflect the nation's needs rather than his own. Roosevelt confronted a decision that tested both political acumen and strategic judgment. Marshall unquestionably merited command in the field. His insight had shaped the overall Allied approach, and his ability to organize large-scale operations was unmatched. However, his presence in Washington was indispensable. Marshall orchestrated the global war effort, navigating multiple theaters of conflict while maintaining close liaison with Congress to secure funding and sustain support. He coordinated with British military leaders, liaised with the Navy, and managed complex personalities, including General Douglas MacArthur in the Pacific. Additionally, he oversaw industrial mobilization, ensuring that troops worldwide were consistently supplied with equipment and armaments. Within the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admirals Ernest King and William Leahy were adamant that removing Marshall from his Washington role would jeopardize the war effort. They contended that no other officer could fulfill his multifaceted responsibilities. By late 1943, the question reached urgency. At conferences in Cairo and Tehran during November and December, Allied leaders confronted the critical issue of who would command Operation Overlord. Stalin pressed for clarity, suspicious of Anglo-American delays and seeking assurance that the invasion of Western Europe would proceed as planned. Churchill privately endorsed Marshall for the command but expressed concern over losing his exceptional coalition management skills. Roosevelt, weighing the options, recognized the tension between rewarding Marshall's operational brilliance and retaining his unmatched administrative and diplomatic capabilities in the capital. To gauge Marshall's personal inclination, Roosevelt dispatched Harry Hopkins to Cairo in early December 1943. Marshall declined to express a preference, affirming instead that he would fully support whichever decision the president deemed best. On December 5, 1943, Roosevelt met Marshall in private. According to Marshall's own account, after some initial hesitation, Roosevelt asked him directly about his intentions. Marshall reiterated his previous stance: personal ambition could not dictate choices of such magnitude. The nation's requirements were paramount. Roosevelt reportedly responded that he could not rest if Marshall were absent from Washington. The president's judgment was thus settled. Marshall would remain as Army Chief of Staff, overseeing the coordination of the global war effort, while someone else would lead Overlord. 2 days later, on December 7, exactly the second anniversary of Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt informed General Dwight D. Eisenhower of his appointment to command the cross-channel invasion. Eisenhower, expecting that Marshall would take the role himself, was initially taken aback. He had been preparing to return to Washington to assume the position of Chief of Staff, and suddenly he found himself entrusted with one of the most consequential military operations in history. That same day, Marshall notified Stalin and Churchill of the decision, providing Eisenhower with a copy accompanied by a brief handwritten note emphasizing the historical significance of the moment. The rationale behind Roosevelt's choice became evident upon closer examination. Operation Overlord was not merely a test of battlefield ingenuity. It represented an unprecedented organizational and diplomatic challenge, involving coordination of forces from multiple nations with differing command structures, strategic priorities, and tactical doctrines. The planned assault encompassed over 3 million personnel, nearly 7,000 naval vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and innumerable support elements. Success would hinge less on individual heroics than on the ability to integrate complex logistics, maintain alliance cohesion, and synchronize military and political objectives. Eisenhower's aptitude for coalition leadership, coupled with his diplomatic skill and strategic foresight, made him uniquely suited for this responsibility. Eisenhower's reputation for fostering trust was critical. British troops and commanders respected him. Churchill tolerated occasional disagreements, and even Charles de Gaulle, known for his suspicion of Anglo-American motives, accepted his authority. Beyond tactical command, Eisenhower possessed a comprehensive grasp of the broader implications of modern warfare, integrating considerations of politics, economics, civil affairs, and public perception. His prior successes in North Africa and Sicily demonstrated an ability to manage multinational operations under combat conditions. Furthermore, he had cultivated a leadership style that combined decisiveness with attentiveness to subordinates, encouraging input while maintaining ultimate authority. These attributes made him exceptionally qualified to command a coalition where unity of effort outweighed battlefield brilliance. Upon arriving in London in January 1944, Eisenhower encountered immediate obstacles that underscored Roosevelt's wisdom. The first challenge involved revising the initial assault plan, which called for a limited landing of 3 divisions along a narrow front under British Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan's guidance. Recognizing the operational risk, Eisenhower expanded the plan to include 5 divisions on a broader front, enhancing flexibility and reducing vulnerability to German counterattack. This adjustment demanded additional landing craft, air support, and logistical resources, necessitating delicate negotiations with Churchill, the Allied chiefs of staff, and naval authorities. Eisenhower's persuasive abilities secured the necessary reinforcement. The second challenge centered on command relationships. British General Bernard Montgomery was designated to lead all ground forces during the initial landings, including both British and American units. While this arrangement satisfied British interests, it caused friction among certain American generals who perceived Montgomery as overly cautious. Eisenhower carefully delineated authority, granting Montgomery operational control during the landing phase while planning a post-breakout transition to American leadership, successfully maintaining coalition cohesion. The final major issue involved General George S. Patton. Despite controversy over his past actions, both Eisenhower and Marshall recognized that Patton's aggressive leadership would be critical once mobile operations commenced. Eisenhower devised a solution that leveraged Patton's strengths while managing the political and operational risks. Patton would command the Third Army, which would activate only after a successful landing and breakout. Until that moment, he became a central figure in Operation Fortitude, the Allies' elaborate deception strategy. Fortitude aimed to convince German intelligence that the main invasion would occur at the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy, thereby diverting enemy forces from the actual landing site. This required creating a fictitious army, the 1st United States Army Group, or FUSAG, complete with false radio traffic, dummy equipment, and staged troop movements. The ruse was meticulously designed to ensure that even after the Normandy landings commenced, German command would continue to believe Calais remained the primary target. Through these measures, Eisenhower's leadership demonstrated the very qualities that had justified Roosevelt's decision: strategic insight, diplomatic skill, and organizational mastery, proving that the successful. In early 1944, the Allies executed one of the most elaborate deceptions of the Second World War. A fictitious army group known as FUSAG existed entirely in illusions, on paper, in phony radio chatter, through mock equipment placed across Dover and southeastern England, and via intelligence reports from German agents who were in fact controlled by British double agents. To make the ruse convincing, the Allies needed a figurehead whose presence would seem plausible and whose reputation would make the threat credible. Only one name fit the criteria: General George S. Patton. Although sidelined in previous controversies, Patton was widely acknowledged by German intelligence as the Allies' most formidable field commander. His appointment to lead FUSAG lent the illusion immediate legitimacy. The Germans accepted this without question. Their intelligence apparatus, including the Abwehr and the Sicherheitsdienst, dedicated immense effort to tracking FUSAG's supposed activities. They photographed dummy landing craft constructed from scaffolding and canvas, intercepted transmissions from mobile units simulating 11 non-existent divisions, and received reports from agents who were in fact under British control via the double-cross system. The final touch was Patton himself. He toured installations, gave speeches, and met with subordinate officers. Every piece of intelligence reinforced the Germans' belief that Patton commanded a vast force poised to strike at Calais. The deception worked because it aligned with German strategic reasoning. Calais offered the shortest crossing from England, roughly 20 miles versus Normandy's 100-mile journey, and provided the most direct path to Germany's industrial heartlands in the Ruhr. Crucially, German commanders understood Patton's battlefield prowess. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, when later asked about Allied leaders, remarked simply that Patton was the Allies' finest combat strategist. German analysts, including Erwin Rommel, had studied his operations in North Africa, while Hitler dismissed him as a crazy cowboy in a tone mixing scorn with grudging admiration. The logic seemed unassailable. The Allies would deploy their strongest general for the main invasion, not a secondary diversion. Therefore, wherever Patton appeared, the Germans assumed the primary assault would occur. The ruse included a particularly audacious maneuver involving General Hans Kremer, a German officer repatriated for medical reasons. Prior to leaving England in May 1944, Kremer dined with Patton, who was presented as Fusage commander. During the meal, Patton casually discussed preparations for the Calais invasion. Afterwards, Kremer toured southern England, observing vast troop concentrations and following road signs indicating he was near Dover. In reality, he was in southwestern England, witnessing genuine preparations for Operation Overlord. Yet, by the time Kremer reached neutral Sweden and reported back to German intelligence, he reinforced every assumption the Germans had already made. Patton commanded a massive force preparing to strike Calais. While Patton acted as a decoy, General Dwight D. Eisenhower focused tirelessly on the actual invasion. He relocated his operational headquarters to Telegraph Cottage outside London, allowing him to plan without distraction. Eisenhower personally visited every division slated for the assault, spending hours with American, British, and Canadian units. His presence conveyed more than orders. He projected confidence, cultivated trust, and demonstrated genuine concern for the soldiers' welfare. Troops recognized him not as a distant bureaucrat, but as a commander intimately aware of their challenges and sacrifices. Eisenhower also confronted the most difficult decisions a military leader can face. He authorized the airborne operations despite forecasts predicting as much as 70% casualties among paratroopers who would land behind enemy lines. He understood the stakes. Without airborne forces securing the flanks, the amphibious landings might fail. Weather complicated planning further. Originally scheduled for June 5, D-Day faced storms that forced a postponement. Meteorologists predicted a short window of better weather on June 6, followed by renewed turbulence. Any additional delay risked operational security and allowed German forces more time to strengthen defenses. Eisenhower decided to proceed on June 6, later describing it as the loneliest choice of his life. On the evening of June 5, as troops boarded ships and aircraft readied for the assault, Eisenhower visited the 101st Airborne Division at their Newbury airfield. These paratroopers would drop into Normandy hours before dawn, securing bridges and key junctions under expected heavy casualties. Eisenhower moved among the men, speaking quietly, making light jokes, and asking about their hometowns. A photographer captured a striking moment as Eisenhower conversed with Lieutenant Wallace Strobel, whose expression mirrored the tension shared by all soldiers. Afterward, Eisenhower returned to his headquarters carrying a written statement accepting full responsibility should the invasion fail. The message read in part, "Our landings have failed and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based on the best information available. The troops, the air, and the Navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame attaches, it rests with me alone." This combination of strategic deception, meticulous planning, personal leadership, and calculated risk would define the success of Operation Overlord and cement the legacy of those who commanded it. On the morning of June 6, 1944, the skies over the English Channel began to clear, signaling the start of a monumental military operation. At approximately 6:30 a.m., forces from the United States, United Kingdom, and Canada commenced landings across 5 distinct sectors spanning nearly 50 miles of the Normandy coastline. The amphibious assault involved a vast armada of around 7,000 vessels, including battleships, transport ships, landing craft, and support vessels, while more than 11,000 aircraft provided air cover and reconnaissance throughout the day. By nightfall, roughly 156,000 Allied troops had successfully reached French shores, though the cost was steep, around 10,000 casualties. Omaha Beach experienced the heaviest American losses, as entrenched German defenses nearly forced the attackers back into the sea. Despite the fierce opposition, the Allies secured all their assigned beachheads by midnight, marking the beginning of the liberation of Western Europe. The operation's success owed much to meticulous planning and careful diplomacy. Expanding the assault across multiple sectors prevented the German army from concentrating forces on any single point, while airborne operations, though costly and widely dispersed, confused enemy commanders and delayed their response. Naval bombardments provided essential support to infantry struggling under heavy fire, and control of the skies prevented German aircraft from threatening vulnerable troops and vessels. Perhaps most crucially, Allied deception efforts worked flawlessly. Adolf Hitler remained convinced that the primary invasion would strike at Calais, leaving the German 15th Army stationed there instead of reinforcing Normandy. British double agents, most notably Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, continued transmitting reports to German intelligence describing preparations at the fictitious Fusak headquarters and explaining delays in the supposed Calais invasion. Hitler accepted these reports without question, keeping armored divisions idle that could have otherwise crushed the Normandy beachhead. While planners had hoped this ruse might buy a 2-week advantage, it ended up delaying German reinforcements for a full 7 weeks, creating a strategic edge equivalent to dozens of battlefield victories. General George S. Patton, whose reputation was central to the deception plan, learned of the Normandy landings the same way as the general public, by listening to BBC radio on the morning of June 6. Though he understood that his absence was a deliberate component of Allied strategy, he expressed personal frustration at being sidelined from what would become one of history's most significant military operations. In letters to his family, he described the difficulty of watching from a distance, acknowledging the glory passing him by while remaining confident in the eventual success of the campaign. Ironically, Patton's non-participation in the initial assault was arguably his greatest contribution. His very presence as the supposed commander of a fictitious army kept critical German reserves fixed at Calais, directly aiding the success of the Normandy operation. Allied intelligence and Eisenhower's strategic foresight transformed Patton's reputation into a force multiplier, proving that psychological leverage and deception could be as decisive as any combat maneuver. By August 1, 1944, following 2 months of intense combat in Normandy, Patton's Third Army became fully operational. The breakthrough had been achieved by Operation Cobra, launched on July 25, which pierced German defensive lines west of St. Lou and opened a path for rapid armored advances. Patton's forces, employing tactics honed over decades, moved with unprecedented speed, striking enemy positions from unexpected directions and encircling units before they could regroup. The Third Army's progress across France was extraordinary. From Brittany, Patton's forces pivoted east toward Paris and then turned northeast toward Germany. By August 25, American troops entered Paris, and by the end of the month, the Third Army had liberated most of Brittany, sealed the Falaise pocket, captured numerous towns, and taken thousands of prisoners. The pace of the advance frequently outstripped that of airborne units, whose planned drop zones were sometimes overtaken by Patton's armored divisions. In just 30 days, the Third Army achieved ground gains originally projected to require half a year. The advance slowed in late August due to logistical constraints, particularly the enormous demand for fuel, which exceeded delivery capacity. Eisenhower faced a critical decision: concentrate all available resources on Patton's units, allowing a deep thrust into German territory at the potential cost of other fronts, or distribute supplies across a wider front, maintaining steady progress for all Allied forces, but limiting the depth of any single penetration. During World War II, General Dwight D. Eisenhower opted for a broad front approach in the Allied advance across Western Europe. He believed that spreading the offensive along multiple axes, rather than concentrating on a single thrust, would reduce risk and provide a higher likelihood of long-term success. General George S. Patton, known for his aggressive tactics, disagreed vehemently. He argued that with sufficient supplies he could have reached Berlin by Christmas 1944. This clash of strategic philosophies, broad front versus narrow thrust, would remain a topic of military debate for years to come. Yet Eisenhower's choice reflected his responsibility for the success of the entire campaign, rather than the achievements of any individual army. The soundness of Eisenhower's strategy faced its sternest test in December 1944. Adolf Hitler launched his last significant offensive, assembling in secret a massive strike through the Ardennes forest. The Germans aimed to split the Allied armies and retake the critical port of Antwerp. On December 16, 3 German armies attacked the American lines, which were thinly held and overextended. The assault, later known as the Battle of the Bulge, immediately created a crisis that demanded Eisenhower's most skillful leadership as supreme commander. Within hours, he was coordinating the Allied response, recognizing that the German push, while serious, also presented an opportunity. The advancing German forces had outstripped their supply lines, leaving them vulnerable to counterattack. Eisenhower acted quickly. He reinforced threatened sectors, authorized tactical withdrawals to preserve his forces, and orchestrated coordination between American, British, and French units to contain the penetration. One of the most critical challenges was the situation at Bastogne, a strategic crossroads surrounded by enemy forces. The 101st Airborne Division was trapped, and its loss could allow the Germans to advance westward toward Antwerp. Eisenhower turned to Patton, assigning him the daunting task of redeploying the Third Army northward to strike the southern flank of the German Bulge and relieve Bastogne. On December 19, Eisenhower met with Patton and General Omar Bradley at Verdun to plan the operation. When Eisenhower asked when Patton could launch his counterattack, Patton confidently projected December 22. Eisenhower initially doubted that an entire army could redeploy so rapidly, dismissing the timeline as unrealistic. Yet Patton had already prepared contingency plans based on intelligence collected by his chief officer, Colonel Oscar Coe, who had correctly anticipated the German offensive. Upon returning to Third Army headquarters in Nancy, Patton simply issued the prearranged code word, triggering one of the fastest and most complex operational maneuvers in modern military history. By December 22, Third Army began moving north through harsh winter conditions, driving 3 divisions toward Bastogne despite heavy German resistance and logistical difficulties. On December 26, elements of the 4th Armored Division successfully reached the besieged town, linking up with the 101st Airborne. Additional reinforcements arrived, and by the end of January 1945, Allied forces had pushed the Germans back to their original positions. Hitler's final gamble had collapsed. The Battle of the Bulge highlighted the complementary strengths of Eisenhower's strategic coordination and Patton's audacious tactical leadership. Eisenhower managed the overall theater, allocating resources and determining where to defend and where to strike, while Patton executed rapid, aggressive maneuvers that many considered impossible. By March 1945, Allied forces had crossed the Rhine River and were advancing deep into German territory. On March 1, the Third Army captured Trier, despite Eisenhower's suggestion to bypass the city to conserve forces. Patton famously replied that he had taken the city with fewer troops than estimated and rhetorically asked if he should return it. This exchange exemplified Patton's boldness and his relentless drive to accomplish objectives others deemed unfeasible. Over the next few months, Third Army raced through Germany, liberating the Ohrdruf concentration camp, the first camp freed by American troops. Patton compelled local civilians to tour the site, confronting them with the reality of Nazi atrocities. His forces captured large numbers of German prisoners, linked up with advancing Soviet units, and penetrated as far as Czechoslovakia before their advance was halted by orders. When Germany surrendered on May 8, 1945, Third Army's record was extraordinary. From August 1, 1944 to VE Day, Patton's forces had secured or liberated roughly 81,500 square miles across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. They captured approximately 1.28 million enemy soldiers and inflicted an estimated 500,000 casualties. Third Army's losses, though significant, were proportionally lower than many other Allied formations, illustrating Patton's principle that a relentless offensive could reduce overall casualties by preemptively destroying enemy capability. Still, all of this was made possible by Eisenhower's leadership. His meticulous planning, diplomatic skill, and ability to manage a coalition of sometimes contentious commanders from Montgomery and de Gaulle to Patton himself ensured the success of operations from Normandy to the Elbe. Eisenhower's aptitude for balancing strategic priorities, approving high-risk maneuvers, and coordinating complex responses to crises demonstrated why he was the ideal supreme commander. The sidelining of America's most capable combat general during D-Day is explained not by Patton's lack of skill, but by the nature of Overlord itself. It required a visionary organizer, diplomat, and strategist rather than a battlefield tactician. While General George S. Patton is widely recognized as one of America's most formidable tactical commanders, perhaps unrivaled in battlefield brilliance, the leadership requirements of Operation Overlord were of a different nature. Success in this monumental undertaking demanded an officer capable of managing an international coalition, navigating complex political relationships, planning large-scale operations across multiple theaters, and sustaining the confidence of Allied governments and military branches. Dwight D. Eisenhower excelled in all these areas. Patton, despite his extraordinary combat skills, lacked several critical qualities for supreme command. Incidents such as the slapping episodes, often downplayed as minor lapses, exposed deeper character limitations. His difficulty in controlling anger, inclination toward impulsive choices, and limited political sensitivity rendered him ill-suited for the highest level of command. While these traits could be tolerated or even advantageous at corps or army level, they were liabilities when dealing with the intricate diplomatic and strategic challenges of coordinating a cross-national offensive. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's selection of Eisenhower over General George C. Marshall reflected profound judgment. Marshall possessed unmatched organizational abilities, a far-reaching strategic mind, and yet his greatest contributions were in Washington, where he orchestrated the overall U.S. war effort, managed congressional relationships, coordinated multiple theaters, and secured the political and logistical foundations essential for Allied victories. Removing him from this role to send him to Europe would have addressed one concern while creating a critical gap at the heart of global strategy. By placing Eisenhower in Europe and retaining Marshall in Washington, the administration achieved the optimal configuration of leadership. Patton, for his part, found a role that fully leveraged his capabilities. Once the Normandy landings were successful and the campaign transitioned into mobile warfare, his aggressive tactics and operational boldness proved indispensable. The Third Army's performance in subsequent operations validated every claim about Patton's tactical genius. Though he did not oversee D-Day, he became the general who instilled fear in German forces, executing a strategic framework conceived by Eisenhower and Marshall with remarkable effectiveness. The impact of these leadership decisions extended far beyond World War II. Eisenhower's approach established benchmarks for modern military leadership, emphasizing that victory in contemporary conflicts depends not solely on battlefield acumen, but also on organizational mastery, political insight, coalition building, and strategic foresight. The U.S. military's post-war focus on joint operations, multinational collaboration, and higher-level planning reflects lessons drawn directly from Eisenhower's success. His leadership qualities later translated seamlessly into civilian governance. As president from 1953 to 1961, he applied the same principles to navigate complex geopolitical challenges, from ending the Korean War to managing Cold War tensions without triggering nuclear escalation, demonstrating that the skills essential for supreme command are also critical in the highest levels of civilian leadership. Patton's post-war tenure, in contrast, revealed the limitations of his political instincts. Appointed military governor of Bavaria after Germany's surrender, he generated controversy with his hesitant approach to denazification, comments suggesting that former Nazis could occupy administrative positions, and proposals for confronting the Soviet Union. Political sensitivities ultimately led Eisenhower to relieve him of Third Army Command in October 1945. A subsequent automobile accident near Mannheim on December 8 severely injured Patton, leaving him paralyzed from the neck down. He passed away 12 days later on December 21, 1945 at the age of 60 from complications including pulmonary edema and heart failure. He was interred at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, marked with a simple white cross like those of the soldiers he had led. Marshall continued to serve at the highest levels of public responsibility. As Special Envoy to China in 1945, he attempted to mediate between nationalists and communists, gaining valuable insight into Asian affairs despite the mission's failure. In 1947, as Secretary of State, he introduced the European Recovery Program, later known as the Marshall Plan, providing more than $12 billion in aid over 4 years to 16 Western European nations. The initiative not only rebuilt economies ravaged by war but also stabilized political systems, curbed communist influence, and solidified U.S. leadership in the post-war order. Later, he briefly served as Secretary of Defense during the Korean War, retiring in 1951, and in 1953 became the only professional soldier to receive the Nobel Peace Prize, cementing his legacy as a statesman and strategist. He died on October 16, 1959, at Walter Reed Army Medical Center and was buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. The interplay between Eisenhower, Marshall, and Patton was a defining factor in Allied victory. Each general contributed in a manner that complemented the others. Marshall provided the strategic vision and global coordination from Washington. Eisenhower executed the operational plan and maintained cohesion among the Allied forces in Europe, and Patton delivered the tactical initiative and mobility essential for battlefield success. Victory was not the result of any single individual's brilliance, but of their combined complementary capabilities. Roosevelt's insight in aligning each general with the role best suited to his abilities proved decisive. D-Day's success hinged on meticulous planning, coalition management, and organizational excellence rather than the daring exploits of individual battlefield leaders. Eisenhower's patience, diplomatic skill, and strategic acumen ensured that the invasion proceeded under optimal conditions. Following the breakthrough, Patton's aggressive leadership exploited opportunities in mobile warfare, achieving results that tactical brilliance alone could not have guaranteed. Meanwhile, Marshall's oversight in Washington sustained the strategic, logistical, and political framework necessary for overall success. In the end, the distribution of responsibilities among these three extraordinary leaders illustrates a fundamental principle of leadership in complex enterprises. Effectiveness depends on matching individual strengths to the specific demands of each level. Tactical genius is vital on the battlefield, strategic coordination essential at the national and coalition level, and supreme command requires a blend of diplomacy, organization, and foresight. Eisenhower, Patton, and Marshall each excelled where their unique skills were most needed, creating an integrated command structure that delivered the liberation. Every operational detail had been meticulously arranged under his direction, and his diplomatic acumen ensured that the fragile coalition of allied nations remained cohesive and cooperative. Beyond management and negotiation, Eisenhower demonstrated a strategic foresight that consistently identified the optimal approach to complex, large-scale challenges. Meanwhile, General George C. Marshall's influence from Washington guaranteed that necessary resources and political support were consistently available to the operation. At the same time, General George S. Patton, stationed in England to simulate an impending threat, effectively immobilized significant German forces through his formidable reputation alone, without firing a single shot. When Patton finally entered active combat 2 months after D-Day, his battlefield ingenuity and tactical brilliance exploited the conditions carefully orchestrated by Eisenhower's planning. The Normandy invasion succeeded not simply because of frontline heroics, but because of the deliberate alignment of multiple forms of military excellence. The ultimate success of the operation hinged on President Franklin D. Roosevelt's crucial decision regarding supreme command. Choosing Eisenhower over Patton was not a reflection of Patton's capability or merit, rather it recognized that the nature of this mission demanded a different set of skills. Eisenhower's abilities in coordination, diplomacy, and strategic assessment were uniquely suited to this monumental task. Patton's fame would come soon after, as he spearheaded the breakout from Normandy, led the relief of Bastogne, and advanced deep into Germany. Yet, the credit for orchestrating the D-Day invasion belongs to Eisenhower, whose combination of organizational precision, coalition management, and long-term strategic vision enabled one of the most complex military operations ever undertaken. The decision to assign Patton away from Normandy was a calculated recognition of where each general's talents would have the greatest impact. In effect, Roosevelt's judgment highlighted a fundamental principle of modern military leadership. Victory in large-scale operations requires not just courage and tactical skill, but also the wisdom to deploy commanders according to their strongest attributes. By placing Eisenhower in the position of supreme command and positioning Patton where his aggressive offensive skills could be most decisive, the Allies maximized their operational effectiveness. The outcome validated this approach: the liberation of Europe, the collapse of Nazi tyranny, and the establishment of a stable democratic order that has endured for decades. This episode stands as a lasting example of how effective leadership combines personal talent, situational awareness, and the foresight to assign responsibilities to the individuals best equipped to achieve success. Roosevelt's choice to entrust D-Day to Eisenhower while reserving Patton for other pivotal roles not only shaped the course of the Second World War, but also left a model of strategic human resource alignment in military command that continues to inform leadership thinking to this day.